Trauma theory has become a major field in biblical studies over the past 10 to 20 years. The traumatic origins of the biblical texts have been recognised and explored, and trauma has come to be seen as the force that shapes the story of Israel throughout the Hebrew Bible and the writings of the early church. The hermeneutical tools that have been used in much of biblical scholarship on trauma, however, often rely on a distinction between individual and cultural trauma. I argue that this distinction is unhelpful when approaching the biblical texts, and that a hermeneutical framework that recognises the inseparability of the individual and the collective is more appropriate for reading texts that are born of national trauma and communities living in the shadow of competing empires. This understanding of trauma, however, is not purely an academic or historical exercise. I argue that recognition of the intersection between individual and cultural trauma is vital for contemporary work in dismantling oppressive systems of empire. When we artificially separate the individual and the collective, we place the burden for change on the individual. When we recognise their inseparable nature, we pave the way to liberation from the causes of trauma. Now, due to the confines of time, I'm going to focus on the hermeneutics of trauma today, although I'd be happy to discuss the biblical applications later if anyone has any questions. Now, the generally accepted definition of cultural trauma follows the work of Jeffrey Alexander, who argues that cultural trauma occurs when a social group views an event or situation as a threat to their collective identity. Events in themselves are not inherently traumatic, Alexander argues, but become seen as traumatic as collective narratives that describe the event as a threat are developed and then accepted by the group. It's a phenomenon that occurs on a sociological level. Individual trauma, however, is seen as being a psychological phenomenon. When an individual is subjected to extreme stress, the brain reacts in a way that maximizes survival, stimulating the limbic system and priming the body to fight, flight, or freeze in the face of the danger. Now, other parts of the brain, such as those that deal with language, are less helpful in a life or death situation, and so activity there becomes reduced. Now, these responses are normal survival mechanisms, and yet when this neurological state persists once the danger has passed, we talk about the individual being traumatized. Individual and cultural trauma are therefore often seen as two fundamentally different things. But I argue that individual trauma is sociological as well as psychological, and that individual voices have a powerful part to play in the narrative process of cultural trauma. I will first address the social nature of individual trauma. Although modern understandings of trauma developed in studies into hysteria in the late 19th century, it wasn't until the Vietnam War that study of individual trauma became mainstream. And it was as a result of the experience of American soldiers that post-traumatic stress disorder was first described in 1980. Now, even though PTSD is a clinical diagnosis, we cannot separate it from its social context. PTSD does not occur without a stimulus, and this stimulus is never confined to the individual. With war, for example, it's politicians and military leaders who make the decisions to engage in conflict, even though it's individual soldiers and civilians who experience the reality of it. To separate the individual from the social context of war and to place the burden for recovery upon the individual is to medicalise the issue and fail to recognise the cause of the trauma. The same is true with sexual violence. By definition, sexual violence involves another person. But Judith Herman also points out that patriarchal systems and socially communicated ideas of power and control generally underlie the actions of the perpetrators. So war and sexual violence cause individual trauma. But because these are the majority causes of trauma in Western individuals who also seek treatment, other causes of trauma have historically been ignored in the scholarship. Based on studies of war and sexual violence, trauma has typically been seen as the consequence of a single, unexpected, and overwhelming event. But trauma can be insidious, a result of an ongoing situation that leaves the individual feeling unsafe and lacking in agency. Steph Krapps and Gert Buelens recognise the effects of trauma in situations of, and I quote, dispossession, forced migration, diaspora, slavery, segregation, racism, political violence, and genocide, end quote. Every one of these situations has a social context. Every one of them is a result of colonial social attitudes and the belief amongst the perpetrators that those they oppress are less worthy of human dignity than themselves. However traumatized an individual is by these situations, therapy is not going to solve the problem. We cannot cure someone of the effects of apartheid, for example. Psychological treatment may help support an individual, but unless the social causes of their trauma are addressed, they will continue to be re-traumatized on a daily basis. We see, therefore, that separating individual trauma from its social context is an artificial separation, and one that can result in placing the burden for change on the individual, and thereby trapping them and others in a cycle of trauma. Liberation comes from recognizing that individual trauma always has a social context, and it's through dismantling the causes of oppression and trauma that individuals can genuinely hope for healing. My second point is that traumatized individuals can have powerful voices in challenging collective narratives of cultural trauma. Now, individual trauma is often equated with PTSD, but the diagnostic criteria for PTSD states that individuals must have been experiencing symptoms for a month or more. This is because the symptoms of dissociation, hypervigilance, and lack of narrative are natural responses to extreme stress. In everyday language, we talk about people being in a state of shock after witnessing a violent crime or a natural disaster. This is normal. The brain has been in survival mode, and it doesn't immediately revert back to its more sustainable state just at the flick of a switch. If the survival state persists for weeks or months or even years, it may lead to a diagnosis of PTSD. But for many people, trauma is a process. As the balance returns to the brain, people start to try to explain what's happened and to integrate it into their life going forwards. This can include finding ways to rebuild shattered worldviews, since trauma challenges our everyday assumptions that we live in a safe and just world. It's difficult to manage day to day if we don't assume that we are generally safe. But trauma forces people to confront the reality that we are not safe. The construction of narrative is a fundamental part of addressing these worldviews and finding ways to cope in the aftermath of trauma. Narrative, then, is a part of the individual trauma process. Although the biblical scholar David Jansen argues that collective narratives about trauma always silence traumatized individuals because individuals cannot speak meaningfully about their trauma. I argue that individuals can form narrative. When we recognize this, we start to include the individual voices in social debates, and they can therefore influence the collective narratives that are formed. We see this principle in truth commissions, where individuals are given the space to tell their stories, and through them, collective narratives are challenged and reformed. By hearing the voices of traumatized individuals, collective narratives can be influenced, not just by those with power and a platform, but by those directly affected by systems of oppression. When we acknowledge that those who experience the trauma of conflict, patriarchy, colonialism, and empire can speak meaningfully about their trauma, we do away with the artificial separation of individual and cultural trauma and provide the potential for marginalised individuals to be heard. In this, we can see a path to liberation. Thank you.
To Diana, I found that interesting. I also thought in my own context immediately, because I think it's something that I've been reflecting on with other people, the collective trauma of HIV. I said I'm from Southern Africa, and I think globally that was one of the places which had the highest number of cases of people who died, and the consequences. I only started realizing the consequences of that when we also started dealing with COVID-19. And then the reflection was also that, wow, we had that big collective trauma, which in many cases also had its own, although I'm not sure if it does qualify as trauma, but that's what was triggered in me. But individuals as well were traumatized because I remember that one of the biggest things that the church had to deal with was the stigmatization, which unfortunately many times came from the pulpit and from clergy and others. And I was thinking then on one statement that you made. I think you were quoting some scholar that about how collective constructions of meaning for cultural trauma, the narratives, you say that sometimes they tend to maybe silence the individual's trauma. But I was thinking, is it not, like in my context in Southern Africa, things we are a community as much as possible, even with the challenges of globalization. But if someone is in trauma, it's we are in trauma, whether in families or communities or however large the community can be. And I think it's hard to let an individual deal with their own trauma. Of course, a lot of harm is sometimes done in trying to deal collectively with trauma, because sometimes, people are silenced because maybe for just to keep the unity of the community. But then the other option I was thinking of not doing anything as a community is troubling for us sometimes, because you think, okay, what will happen to this person? Where will they, what are the consequences? Then there's this need of trying to come in. And I also was wondering on the trying to deal with trauma through truth commissions and other such forums, because sometimes I've heard comments such as the fact that this is sometimes inadequate, and if it is done too early, it is just done to silence and maybe absolve the perpetrators. I think maybe that's even something which is a problem when we talk about slavery, colonialism, the dispossession of people's land. I know you don't necessarily have answers to this because it covers a lot of issues that have to do with the disenfranchisement of peoples and the large communities and of empire, stamping its authority over people. I think that that's all I have to say. Maybe I've taken enough time. Pui, back to you.